Hello, everybody. This is Matt Williamson from Pop Goes the 60s. My esteemed colleague Glenn Greenberg joins us tonight, and Glenn has joined me before to talk about some of his bookazines. He did one each on McCartney and John Lennon when they turned 80. He's done a trivia book. He's done one on the White Album, and he's got a new one out. Glenn, why don't you tell us what that one is?
Well, I don't only write about the Beatles. I also write, in this particular case, I wrote about Batman,
Oh,
another
excellent.
60s sensation. It's an entire history of the character from his origins and the comic books in the 1930s to today. And we get into the comic books, we get into the serials from the 1940s, we get into the TV show from the 1960s, which is probably what a lot of people who watch this channel remember most about Batman. And then we get into the movies, the animated shows, all of the different changes that he's gone through over the years, all the different mediums that he's been in, and where the character is today. And That was a lot of as somebody whose first comic book I think was Batman all those years ago. This was a lot of fun to work on, and it just hit the stands now. So it's called The Story of Batman. And it's out there right now. You can get it at Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, excellent grocery stores and supermarkets and pharmacies. So just look for it on the shelves.
Great. That sounds like a lot of fun. Well, I just got done having a little bit of fun finishing my Beach Boys series, and the reason I have you on here to talk about the Beach Boys is because you are a big Beach Boys enthusiast.
My outlook on the Beach Boys was probably what a lot of people's outlook was that they were like this safe, white bread, conservative, a bunch of just sweet guys that very inoffensive, did a bunch of surf music, and eventually their leader and main songwriter went nuts, and the lead singer is a jerk, and the drummer hung out with Charles Manson, and that was pretty much the extent of my knowledge of the Beach Boys. And I would say around 1998 or 99. VH1 ran a documentary called Endless Harmony. And I found myself home on a Saturday and I watched it because I guess I had nothing, there was nothing else on TV and I had nothing better to do. And I watched it. And I don't know, something just clicked. And I think it was when they played a clip of um, Heroes and Villains. And I just kind of like something, it flipped a switch inside. Now I'd heard about Heroes and Villains, and I was aware of the Smile Legend, the great unfinished album that they never put out. I'd known about that since my college days, but I never really thought much of it. But this Endless Harmony documentary really opened my eyes, and slowly but surely I started to get into the Beach Boys, get into the music. And I have to give credit to a friend of mine, Jack Silbert. Hi, Jack. He'll be watching this, I'm sure. And he kind of eased me in because he had an extensive Beach Boys collection. He loaned me the box set of Good Vibrations, 30 Years of the Beach Boys.
Mhm.
And I made dupes of it and listened to it on and on and on. And then from there, I just started buying the individual albums. And then I fell into the Smile rabbit hole. Once I realized that there were lots of bootlegs out there about Smile, I started trying to track them all down. And as my wife can attest to, I went deep into that hole, and it took a long time for me to come out. And I became fascinated with that, and it just really captured my imagination and would not let go. And that was around, I would say, around 2000, 2001, because by the time my daughter was born in 2002, I was full blown. I was a full
Mhm.
blown Beach Boys nut.
Well, that's why I have you on because I finished up the six-part series and I really packed a lot into that, but obviously I glossed over some very big areas. And I always focus more on the 60s and the time period surrounding the 60s. So that's always the focus. And as far as the Beach Boys are concerned, for me personally, the late 70s and beyond, I didn't feel really merited a seventh edition of video. So that's maybe for somebody else to finish someday. But I thought we could talk about a couple of things here
Sure.
that I did miss, and some things observations of yours maybe that you felt that I could have elaborated on a little more.
Sure, absolutely.
So the series obviously ended with the Landy era, and I felt the need to really tie up that loose end with Brian's mental state. But I almost ended the video series around the Endless Summer period, which was 1975, which kind of ended their album-oriented rock period. They became an oldies act. They got huge again doing that, going back to their roots, came full circle. And then it took a few years before they did the next studio album in between Holland and that next one, which was 15 Big
15 big
Ones.
ones.
That was obviously, I think, very derivative of the 50s stuff that was going on at the time. And I assume that that's what their thinking was because they were going to do all oldies. And that was a strange transition, I think, even from Endless Summer to do that. And Brian was trying to get back, and they were trying to get Brian back and motivated. They were really having a hard time doing that.
The main thing that was driving the whole doing the oldies thing is because Brian didn't want the pressure of having to write new songs. I think that was a big part of it. I mean, some of the accounts that I've read was, I mean, Brian didn't want to be a Beach Boy after 1967. I mean, they just kept reeling him back in, and he would have much rather just sort of left the orbit altogether. So I mean, he had some irons in the fire. He had some these random projects that he would kind of start and not finish and all that. And I think for him, the pressure of having to go back into the Beach Boys as a full-fledged member, I think for him, what made the most sense was just do an album of oldies. It took the pressure off of him having to write, because I think it was understood he was going to produce the next album, and that was going to be a real shift for him because he hadn't done that in quite a while. And even there, in taking over as producer, the ethos was pretty much get it done, quick and easy, quick and easy, quick and easy. And he left a lot of stuff unfinished that Carl had to go in and basically clean everything up. And I believe that's why he got the title mixdown producer on both 15 Big Ones and the Beach Boys Love You, is that was sort of like a tip of the hat to Carl for basically making the tracks releasable
Okay.
once Brian got done with, because it's just that it's not that they were bad or necessarily bad, it's just they weren't ready. And by the time Brian said, "Okay, I'm done," the rest of the band were like, we can't put this out as is. We have to sort of sweeten it
Mhm.
a little bit." And that's where Carl came in, I believe.
And I think the record companies, both that would have been Warner's at the time,
Yes.
and then the next CBS that came along next, they were completely befuddled with Brian Wilson because they knew that they wanted his the old magic that he had,
Yeah.
and that never did really come back. Although some people rate the next album, The Beach Boys Love You, very high, which
Right.
came out in 1977, and this is the period where after Endless Summer, really the Beach Boys ceased being a relevant band musically speaking. All these other things were coming in. They were competing with punk and with disco, and that was really getting a lot of placement on the charts, and people were buying it in great numbers. And the Beach Boys were kind of an afterthought, and this whole Brian's back thing was rolled out at this time, and he wasn't ready.
No, that it was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Al Jardine was probably the most vocal about it. He kind of shook his head and said that was just so wrong. He said Brian wasn't back. It was nothing more than an empty publicity stunt. And he wasn't back. He wasn't ready. And you could hear it in the music. This was the guy who gave us Pet Sounds, even like a beautiful album, which I happen to like very much. Friends, which is like
Mhm.
this gentle, just easy to listen to, beautifully orchestrated and all that. And then you get to 15 Big Ones and especially Love You. And it's like, you're not, this is not the same guy. Brian's not back. We don't know who this guy is.
Yeah. And some people, some
And
fans rate this album really high. And this is when they brought in Dr. Gene Landy for the first time to
first
try
time.
to get him on track because he was really killing himself with drink and drugs and food
Yeah.
and smoking. So this was actually a period where he was in some ways on the road back. Musically, though, he, just like you said, on the road and musically on the album, I don't think he was back at all. And it's a very odd album, but why do so many people like it?
Well, I mentioned my friend Jack before. And yeah, he described them as the revisionists. They just people who just love to go in and take something that's been sort of a given for a long period of time, and just to be contrary, they got to go in and revise it. He said it kind of half jokingly, but I do see something there. You know, if we're talking about Love You, I, I've called it like the ugliest sounding album the Beach Boys ever put out. It is just there's such a dark and dreariness to the whole thing. The chunky synthesizers and the off note melodies and the vocals, especially the Wilson brothers. Brian sounds bad, and Dennis sounds awful. Even Carl, who had that angelic voice, he's going through a rough patch too. He sounds on some of the songs. I feel like he sounds like somebody who just came out of anesthesia at the dentist's office. You
Mm.
know, having had root canal. He sounds a little slurry and just slow, and it's just it's just a really dreary sounding album. The some of the songs are just weird, just bizarre. Some of the lyrics are troubling.
Mhm.
um as much of a slam as 15 Big Ones gets, and by no means is that a great album, but I actually prefer 15 Big Ones because at least there's a sense of sunniness about it, a sense of fun. There's one song on there called That Same Song, that it's dopey as all get out, but once you hear it, it bores itself into your brain and you're bopping along to it just because it's a fun song. I can't think of anything off of Love You that is that lighthearted and fun. Every just it's a very, and part of the depression comes from just how bad the voices are, and just how what you're not getting because you've heard it before from these guys, and they're giving you something else, and it's just not as pleasing to the ear.
Mhm.
And I don't know how you go in and reassess that. I don't know how you revise that.
Well, I can give you an idea of how that is reassessed, and that is because Brian produced it. This is his last producer credit. The Brian Wilson fans really want it to be better, and
Mhm,
they bring out things like, "Oh, this is their punk album. This is their synth album," as if he was the first to do it. This is not true at all,
mhm.
and we see that kind of praise being heaped upon McCartney's slighted works as well, and they credit him with movements that have been well underway. And, at this point, both McCartney and Brian Wilson by 1977, they weren't leading the pack anymore. McCartney obviously still had a lot of gas left in the tank, but here Brian Wilson much less so.
Yeah,
And I think that's the fact that it is ugly sounding. I think that's a good description for it. But yet people really I think the autobiographical nature of it is what makes it dark and ugly, but that seems to be the reason that people cite that they love it so much.
exactly. They say that you never get a better look into Brian Wilson's state of mind at any other given time. That this
Mhm.
really tells you exactly where Brian was, who he was, what was on his mind, where, and I mean, that's interesting. It doesn't make for easy listening.
Yeah.
It doesn't make for pleasant listening. I mean, Pet Sounds was, I would say, a semi autobiographical album, and there's a lot of stuff in there that came directly from his heart and his soul and his mind. But boy, that's a beautiful album. That is a beautiful
Hmm.
album.
Yeah.
And I guess when you're looking at it from an artistic standpoint, it's like, well, that was beautiful and this is not so beautiful. So that's what makes it so great. And I think that's not an assessment that I necessarily agree with, just because
Hmm.
I don't like listening to ugly sounding music.
Yeah. And I would say, I would also add that something ugly can be very artistic,
Right.
but in this case, it's maybe just ugly for ugly's sake. Or, I mean, this would have been much better as a Brian solo project anyway. It's too bad that the Beach Boys got lumped in, but contractually they had another album to deliver.
Sure.
And I mean, they had nothing, you know. I mean,
Right.
so I mean, it was just a product also of the timing. But I think that I would have been more pleased if this was Brian Wilson's solo album because then it just stands more on its own.
Right.
And, you can't blame the Beach Boys for that.
Well, I just want to also mention that there is a message in the Beach Boys "Love You," um, where they they dedicate the album to Brian, which in itself is kind of weird because if he's the producer, why is the album being like sort of like being dedicated to him? But
Yeah,
they
he's the
say,
writer.
yeah, they say we wish to express our appreciation and acknowledge your willingness to create and support totally the completion of these songs, which is what tipped me off when I first read this, that, he supports the completion of these songs, which to me says he wasn't around for the completion of these songs, which takes us back
Mhm.
to why Carl Wilson has that weird mixed down producer credit.
Yeah, it gets very complicated. And, they're trying to do damage control on just about every album they do. We saw that happen on that with the EP with was it Holland, where
Mount
they
Vernon and Fairway. Yeah.
yeah, where they basically said, "Well, you're probably not going to like this, but and it might piss some other people off." And it's like, I
Yeah.
don't. These guys were just had no clue of how to promote themselves properly. And
No.
this album it came out. Obviously, there's a lot of competition, but Brian was not back, and the contract that came up next also had great demands on him. And in the CBS contract, I understand that Brian Wilson actually cried while signing it because he knew he couldn't fulfill it.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And also he it's not only that he couldn't fulfill it, he really didn't want to be doing this anymore. He just I think he just did not want any responsibility. He didn't want people depending on him anymore. Either he knew he didn't have any gas in the tank, or he was afraid of how it was going to be received, or he just didn't want to work anymore. I mean, maybe he was one of those people that was ready to retire, as soon as he possibly could,
Mhm.
at that point in his life. But it's well known that he did not want to be doing this, at least not with the Beach Boys.
And that's too bad because the Beach Boys probably should have broke up at the endless summer period, and then that would have freed everybody up to do whatever.
Yeah.
Brian wouldn't have had so much pressure on him,
Hmm.
and the Beach Boys would have been left to their own devices. I mean, they could still tour, and they were making big money touring, so that at least would have lasted for a number of years. It still lasted now. So they
Yeah.
had that to always fall back on. And I think that one of the things that the Beach Boys was their Achilles heel, and also, one of the things that made them so special was they were a family. So I think that made it harder to break up. Whereas the Beatles weren't blood related, they broke up. If I think that if there wasn't blood involved here, they might not have made it out of the 60s as a band.
You're absolutely right, because it's again, it's well known that Brian was pulling away um, after Pet Sounds, and he was basically constantly being guilted into coming back in to the Beach Boys fold. You had his father, you had his cousin, you had his wife basically saying, Brian, everybody's counting on you. Do you like this nice house you're living in? We need to keep bringing the money in. And so, you need to basically keep doing this. And he didn't want to. I think the pressure of Pet Sounds and Good Vibrations and Smile just kind of broke him, because that was when he had his 1967 breakdown.
Yeah.
Was in the midst of the pressure of trying to bring Smile to fruition, and he was never the same after that. And I think that coincides with the time where he was just like, I don't want to do any of this anymore. I want out. And he couldn't get out because,
Yeah.
like you said, how do you quit your family? You know,
Yeah.
you
It's
can
really
do it,
too
but it's not
bad.
easy.
I mean, and they could have just, it was hard to keep the Beach Boys going and break ties with Brian Wilson because I think Brian also he seemed to find some stability with the family. There was something to hold on to there,
Hmm.
and after he was institutionalized in late 68 for I'm not sure how long, but he came out of there not quite the same. And there's these checkpoints in his life where he keeps getting further away from the Pet Sounds Brian we knew,
Yes.
and which is, I guess is understandable. The drugs obviously did not help, and he was in poor health. And all that does matter when it comes to mental health. So yeah, he just was in those days. I don't think we don't know what we know now. We didn't know that then in the
Right.
60s in terms of mental health. So if we had what we know now back then, things might have been handled differently. But yeah, it just seems to be that family to be the Achilles heel, and they all were just stuck in it.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. I mean, after the 68 breakdown, um, which coincided around it was around that time where his father sold the music publishing rights.
Mhm.
Um, and there's a lot of question about whether Brian really knew or didn't know or and all that. Um, uh, but he was never the same after that breakdown in 68, the institutionalization. Um, it's been reported that after that they put him on medication. I can't remember if it was Thorazine or they put something. And after that, his attention span was completely altered to the point where he could start things, but he couldn't finish them.
Mm.
He would just lose interest or lose energy, or lose attention, and he just wasn't able to do a complete work anymore. And so that obviously hampered the band and forced them to have to step up. So that by the time you get to 1970, and the Sunflower album, he was prolific. I mean, he wrote a bunch of stuff he wrote about 2 albums worth of material. But the record company didn't find most of it to be usable, sellable, commercial enough. And so they had to keep going back to the drawing board and readjust these
Mhm.
albums. The record company kept rejecting them. And eventually a lot of those songs did trickle out over on subsequent albums. But after really putting himself out there for the premiere of the Warner Brothers era and not being met with a lot of enthusiasm, he started retreating again. And that's when you get into the 70s where he's really becoming more and more eccentric and really pulling back, and you really have to sort of like pull teeth to get any work out of him. He just didn't want to do it anymore.
Yeah, and those songs that he was working on, a lot of those have surfaced. They were recorded at that time,
Yeah.
and I've done some compilations of my albums that never were.
Right.
And I think a lot of them are good songs, but
Yeah.
I can see why a record company would have been like, well, we don't hear a hit here. This isn't what's going on. Give us something else. So I don't think, just like all the other Beach Boys music at the time, which was met with, tepid response, that stuff I think would have been reacted to the same way. So I think that's just where the Beach Boys were at. And that's just kind of they were just in the middle of the road with their fans and with rock music in general. And, they had appeal, but not on the level that the rock bands had.
Well, I mean, look, Sunflower, I rate it as one of their all-time best albums. I think it's right up there. I mean, I don't think it's as good as Pet Sounds, but I think it's up there. It's certainly in their top 2 or 3 albums. And it bombed. I mean, it was their lowest selling album to date, at that point. And so, on top of everything else, on top of the problems that they were having, you're right. The audience wasn't there. The audience didn't care about them anymore. They were passé, and their image was just they were still perceived as, the white bread, corny Disney pop at a time when Led Zeppelin and Crosby, Stills and Nash were on the rise.
Yeah, the Beach Boys weren't the only band that faced that stereotype. I mean, the other band I've done a lot of work on is the Association. Now, they also had AM radio hits, big hits. So by 68, 69, I should say, is when their chart action really went away.
Mhm,
And the album they did in 69, which is self-titled, fantastic album.
mhm.
And it's produced very well. It sounds produced in the era of that first CSN album. And they were just not cool enough. They were no
Right.
longer they were a band from 66, 67. And in those days, the kind of the pre-rock stadium tours and stuff, they could get away with that. But things just changed, and
Right.
they still made a living on the road. They were still in demand. So the association did pretty well for themselves in 68, 69 to 71.
Mhm.
much like the Beach Boys were touring then.
Yeah.
And so they had a following, but they just weren't critically acclaimed as far in the rock arena.
And then by 1973, 74, the Beach Boys, I mean, Rolling Stone rated them the best, like band of the year because of their concerts
That was, yeah, after the Endless Summer, of
after in the
course.
summer.
Yes. So that
But
was, I think, in late 74.
yeah.
So yeah, I think Rolling Stone came around to recognizing their contribution to rock and roll because they returned to the roots.
Mhm.
And you can't really, it's hard to argue with very strong concert attendance because they became huge again on the road. And had that not happened, I mean, they just would have been faded into oblivion, I
Right.
suppose. So I
Right.
think the Endless Summer thing was a good thing for them. It allowed them to continue to work, and they signed, contracts were signed based on the strength of, excuse me, of Endless Summer, and that double album that followed it, Spirit of America, which also sold well.
Yeah.
So I mean, I guess that helped them to a degree. I personally could, it would have made sense for them if they had broke up after
Sure.
Holland,
Hmm.
had this Endless Summer stuff and this resurgence, and then they could have toured, maybe every other year as the Beach Boys, with or without Brian, and then they could have done an album as the Beach Boys or done solo stuff. The guy that really, I think, we talk about Brian not having it in him and couldn't finish things. What about Dennis Wilson? All these songs he had, and he's got one solo album released to show for it. And this was another guy who just couldn't get it together.
It's a tragedy because if you listen to Sunflower and you listen to Dennis's stuff, Dennis has probably, most of the most interesting stuff on Sunflower. Great, great songs. Some of the stuff that never was released in his lifetime that have since come out in the last few years. Terrific. There's one song of his. It's one of my favorite Beatles songs. Excuse me, Beach Boys songs called "San Miguel." Just a
Hmm.
just a great funky little song. He would delve a little bit into schmaltzy stuff, and if you want to know what I mean, you can listen to his stuff on Carl and the Passions. And I think there's a couple of songs on Holland that are just like a little overblown. But when he wanted to get down into a groove, Dennis was great. And Pacific Ocean Blue was better than anything that the Beach Boys were doing during that same period. His
Yeah.
his one solo album. With Dennis, like Brian, he was just, he was an addictive personality and he would just get swallowed up by his addictions. I also think the whole Manson thing really broke him. I think he carried so much guilt, and I think it screwed up his head so much that he once said, he goes, "Don't ask me about that. I will never talk about it. For the
Hmm.
rest of my life, I will never talk about it." And then you look at pictures of him in the mid to late 70s, and he basically looks like Manson. He's basically Cop Manson's look,
That's
which
true.
is which is kind of scary when you think about it. I think that broke him. I think he could have had a brilliant solo career, but in some ways he was even worse than Brian in terms of not being able to finish what he started. That second album just, he kept working on it, putting it aside, working on it, and it never came about. But
And he had material, I think, on Surf's Up that was it Surf's Up or Sunflower. He had material that he pulled back.
yes,
I think it was Surf's
it
Up.
was Surfs Up.
That would have made that the material that was pulled back was very strong material.
Yeah,
And I think it would have put that album into the stratosphere, or at least made it much stronger.
yeah.
And he was always kind of quitting the band, going to go solo. He's back in the band, but you're right. I mean, as far as rock, I mean, he could groove and he could rock. The other Beach Boys couldn't really rock. I mean, he couldn't really. I mean, with some rare exceptions, this was
Right.
not a band that was really grooving and laying down a heavy beat,
Hmm.
which, in the rock arena was expected of you. And they were very, like Dennis did a lot of ballads and they were a lot more just mellow bands. Now there were other mellow bands out there as well, like America, who they
America.
toured with. Chicago had its own brand of mellow but with a really great brass section. But I mean, these were the new bands, and they had a new sound, and it was much more vibrant than anything the Beach Boys were doing.
Yeah.
So they were victims of what was going on around them as well.
They took an important lesson from the Endless Summer success, and they took the wrong lesson from the Endless Summer success, which was that that's all the audience wanted was just the old stuff over and over and over again. And then you do that and you lose the enthusiasm of more than half your band, because
Mhm.
Carl, Dennis, and to a lesser extent, Brian didn't want to just rest on their laurels and just give the same old, the same old. But Mike, and I guess to a certain extent, Al, were more like, just give the people what they want.
Yeah.
And that wasn't going to be satisfying for Carl and Dennis. And at that point, as you get later into the 70s, Brian didn't care one way or the other. But
Yeah.
but that's where a lot of the friction came from. And there's that famous fight that Dennis and Mike got into on stage, where
Mhm.
after the show, I think it was in New York, where they're at the airport, and Dennis turned to a reporter and said, "You've just witnessed the end of the Beach Boys."
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of it had to do with the conflict had a lot to do with the two different directions that the group wanted to go in. And I understand where Mike was coming from. You've got three guys in your group that you can't rely on because their heads are, being screwed up by drugs, alcohol, and maybe a combination of the two. And so we can't count on them to come up with new material. We can't count on them to lead the creative end of this. We have to stick with the tried and true, because that's what's going to keep bringing the money in. That's what we're depending on. This is our
Yeah.
careers.
And I was all for the other guys trying to pitch in. I mean, you got to pitch in to, help the sinking ship. That goes back to the late 60s. And everybody did pitch in to a degree, but really,
Yeah.
Jardine and Mike Love, they weren't really songwriters. I mean, Mike Love could write lyrics, but
Right.
as far as drafting musical melody, that was not his forte. You know, Bruce Johnston, good producer, he could write a bit, but the real writers, Dennis and Brian, they were just, AOL. And if those guys had gone off on their own and done their own thing together or separately and left the remaining Beach Boys, I don't think those guys would have gotten the contract. But they may have gotten something smaller and they could have done a couple small albums and continued touring.
Right.
I think that would have been fine. But including Brian and Dennis, and the whole thing just was dragged down and it just got really weird.
Yeah, I mean, Dennis was damaged goods. I'd say right before the mid 70s kicked in. I mean, I don't think he was ever the same after he damaged his hand and couldn't play the drums for a long period of time. And and then there's that infamous incident where erstwhile manager, I think it was Stan Love and Brian's caretaker, this guy named
Mhm.
Rocky Pamplin,
Mhm.
they found out that Dennis had gotten some heroin to Brian. And
Yes.
I think it was during Super Bowl Sunday or something. They knew where Dennis was going to be, and they just decided. I think they were in like a drunken state. Let's go take care of Dennis. And they went after him, and they beat him up so badly they damaged his throat, and he never really recovered from that. So there's this late 70s, early 80s footage of Dennis in concert singing "You Are So Beautiful," and
Mhm.
it's barely above a croak,
Oh, I know.
because his vocal cords were damaged by the beating that he took from his cousin. And
See,
and and
I didn't know that came from the beating. I thought that was just abusing his body for the most part.
this is what I've read, is that they damaged his larynx.
Hmm. There was
So
another fight. The other cousin, was it Steve Love, who got into it with Carl as well. So this was a issue of trying to keep drugs away from the
yeah,
Wilson boys,
yeah,
and it got so physical that people were getting literally beaten.
yeah.
And this, I mean, maybe it's time to break up. I mean, really.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it's like Carl, who always managed to sort of remain above the fray, and he had this angelic face and this angelic voice, and there was just something so gentle and sweet about him, that he gave off. And he ended up getting falling into an addiction. I guess it was drinking and cocaine. I think there was heroin also. And you could find it on YouTube. I don't know if it's still on. Ever since YouTube became this mammoth commercial machine, um, a lot of stuff is gone. But for the longest time on YouTube, there was this concert that had been filmed in Australia from 1978, I think. and the Beach Boys hired a film crew to film them in concert. And Carl is so in a bad state where they're performing All This Is That. And that's a song where Carl is singing lead on it. So you would imagine that he should be on camera while he's singing lead. And so the camera is on Carl while he's playing keyboards, and he's glaring at the camera, and he's like rolling his eyes like to the side as if to say, get this camera off me. Get it. And he like actually goes like that. He moves his head, get the camera off me. He doesn't want to be filmed, which is tough when you've hired a film crew to film you and your band when you're in concert.
Hmm.
So he was out of it, and you could see his eyes are like glazed over. I'm not sure if it's the same show, but I think it was the same tour where they were performing Good Vibrations. And at the end, that end part, gotta keep those love and good vibrations. So he fell into this loop and just kept going over and over and over that one part, and the band couldn't get out of it. It's going
Mm.
on and on. And you can hear, if you watch the footage, you can hear the audience starting to get restless.
Mm.
And you can see the band is starting to get restless. And who comes to the rescue of all people? Brian. Brian comes in and remembered the lost piece of Good Vibrations that never made it into the final version of the song that got put out. He started going hum me da oh hum, and that was I don't know if any of the band had thought about that part of the song in about 10 years, 11 years, and Brian sort of inserted that into the performance, and that kind of like threw Carl out of that endless loop that he was in, and they were able to finish the song. It's
Wow.
all caught on tape. It's all out there.
Hmm.
Um, and like I said, I saw it all on YouTube a bunch of years ago. It might still be there,
Hmm.
but it just I mean, when you can't count on Carl anymore,
Yeah.
that's when you know you're in trouble.
Well, there was another show where he actually he fell down on
Yeah.
stage because he was, I think, drunk.
Firstly, I would like to apologize to those members of the audience who left last night because of my behavior. And secondly, to my family and to the rest of the group members.
Why are you apologizing to them?
Because I made it very difficult for them to perform last night. And,
Were you drunk?
Huh?
Were you drunk?
I was affected. What happened was I did not feel well yesterday. And I had a Valium, which is a mild tranquilizer. And I had 2 Mai Tais without having a meal. And I think it must have been the rum.
Do you regularly?
Yeah. So when Carl is in bad shape, I mean, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
But they still soldiered on. I mean, they brought back Bruce Johnston to
Yeah.
produce.
Yeah.
And so they just kept going, and then they, had that kind of that disco misstep with Here Comes the Night. And they were, I
Well,
mean,
that
they
was
were,
Bruce. That was Bruce's idea.
okay.
In
Well,
fact, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I was just going to say, I forgot that was Bruce's idea. And I guess it's produced well, but I mean, is anybody going to buy the Beach Boys at disco? I mean, this is a full year even after Ringo Starr bottomed out with his disco album. I mean, they
Yeah.
got on it really late.
Al Jardine has some great quotes about the disco version of Here Comes the Night. Now, I love the 1967 version. It's a favorite of mine. Al basically he basically threw Bruce Johnson under the bus. He said that was Bruce. He said it's technically very, very good, but we were pandering to the audience. We never should have done it. We were booed, and we deserved to be, something. He said something along those lines. They performed it live once, and the response from the audience was so bad that they never performed it again live.
Wow.
And if I remember correctly, after the reaction to hear the disco version of Here Comes the Night, that show, they started taking requests.
Wow.
Now, when a band of that stature says, "All right, what do you want to hear tonight?" that's really bad.
Yeah.
That's a bad moment.
That's beyond jumping the shark. That's you've been
Yeah.
decaying on the beach for a long time by then. Wow.
So yeah, but bringing back Bruce was a desperation move, and I think you covered this in your video. Was because Brian was supposed to produce that album, and after a few days, he just said, "I can't do it." Get Bruce Johnson.
Yeah, that was at I forget the guy's name. At the CBS president was
Walter
kind of
Yetnikoff.
Yetnikoff. Yeah, he was basically coming in and trying to not give him a pep talk, but he was probably very angry with how things were going. And they
Yeah,
signed the big contract with the Beach Boys and they just didn't deliver anything. And he has to come in and basically scold them like children.
right.
So yeah, that was would have been a tough pill to swallow. I can't imagine the Beach Boys sitting there, you know.
Yeah, and I was very glad to see you included that because I mean your 6-part series was great and very inclusive, but you couldn't
Thank
get
you.
everything in. And I was really glad that was one of the things that you included because it's such a great story.
Yeah, and I think it was important and Brian was trying. So, hey, I've got some ideas, and he's still trying.
Yeah,
And they just, were whipping the dead horse, just flogging it to death. And
yeah,
it's really a shame. And they had a couple other high points in, post 1980. Obviously, lose Dennis. Brian gets back on the Landy train out of desperation because they think he's going to die. He's lost his marriage. He nearly lost his life a couple times. And if they didn't do something, and they did the drastic thing of bringing Landy back, which they had no idea Landy would take it to another level that I, which is nobody could have predicted that. I don't think.
right, right. In fact, supposedly there was talk about putting Dennis under Landy's care as well. And Brian was in such bad shape at the time that as the story goes, Carl made the decision. We have to focus on Brian first. Brian's actually in worse shape. If by 1982, they thought that Brian would be dead within a year. That's how bad shape he was in. So Carl's feeling was, well, let's focus on Brian first, and then after the holidays, which would have been December 1983, after the holidays, we'll turn our attention to Dennis.
Hmm.
And of course, Dennis didn't make it past the holidays.
Yeah. Since we have some redemption for Brian, which we'll get into momentarily here,
Mhm.
it's really sad that Dennis didn't get there. Because he didn't seem to have the mental problems that Brian had,
Right.
but he didn't make it.
Yeah, he's just the alcohol with him. It was more than I think anything else. It was the alcohol that
Yeah.
just did him in.
And then Brian starts building back. He ends up doing it. Landy takes over, controls his life,
Yeah.
but he gets him in great shape. He does a solo album, and then the Kokomo incident comes out. And this is another point in the Beach Boys history that's notable for a couple things. They have a surprise hit song, it goes to number one, and Brian Wilson fans hate it because of, I think, some very bad information that came out with some very unscrupulous writers. And this was actually more Eugene Landy's doing. And would you care to tell the Kokomo story?
Well, Brian has always maintained, and you got to take everything Brian says with a grain of salt because there's a lot he was fed by Landy. So as far as Brian knew, he wasn't asked to be on Kokomo. I'm My supposition is that's what Landy told him because Landy was fielding all of Brian's contact. All of his communications were filtered through Landy. So Brian has always maintained that he was never asked. They wanted to do it without him. You talk to Mike and you talk to Al, and they tell you that's absurd. Of course, they wanted Brian to be part of it. Mike, in particular, has been very vocal about the fact that they wanted Brian, they invited Brian, they had to go through Landy, and Landy was demanding an executive producer credit, and he wanted to be there every step of the way. He might have even wanted to go as far as to rewrite the lyrics. And this was a song that was co-written by Mike. So, I mean, it's like Mike isn't going to take kindly to this. So they basically told Landy what he can go do with himself. And he basically held Brian hostage and probably, presumably, cast the Beach Boys in the worst possible light because there is footage of Brian saying, no, I was never asked. They wanted to do that one on their own, which I'm sure he believed, because I'm sure that's what he was told. But no, they wanted Brian. In fact, Van Dyke Parks, who was in the Brian camp during the Smile era and afterwards, certainly not in the Mike Love camp, but Van Dyke Parks participated in the Kokomo recording. I think he played accordion on that track. So even he was involved. I mean, if he was going to be there for Mike, Brian certainly would have, been a welcome at that party.
Hmm.
So it's crazy. And so yeah, so the perception amongst Beach Boys fans, or Beach Boys fans who weren't as in the know, believe Brian's version of it, and they hate the song. And they said it's the worst thing that the Beach Boys ever put out, and also because they knew that Mike was really the one behind it, the real sort of cheerleader behind it, and the driving force. It was just another excuse to bash Mike. And as far back as, again, as the song came out in 1988, I liked the song back then.
Hmm.
I was, I enjoyed it without even knowing much about the Beach Boys. And so I always liked it. And it's always been my contention that had Brian been at that recording session, his voice was on there, and had the writing credits included Brian's name as one of the writers, those same people who say it's the worst thing that they ever put out would be saying, look, Brian's genius is still there. I mean, but he still got it, that boy. 20 years after Good Vibrations, he comes up with another #1 hit. Who else can do that? Brian will. And it's purely because of all the behind the scenes stuff that they think that they know, is why that song was bashed as badly as it is. Because, I mean, why is it any worse than any of the other Fun in the Sun songs that the Beach Boys had that were all hits? It's no worse than
Exactly.
any of them. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously there's not a lot of 60s bands having #1 songs in the 80s, a few, and that was one of the last ones. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's kind of it's what I wouldn't call it a novelty song, but bordering on that. It's a fun song, and
Yeah.
you might love it, you might hate it, but it still got to #1.
Right.
And it was co-written by John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, Terry Melcher, and Scott McKenzie.
Right.
So this song, I can see why they maybe thought highly of it. Mike Love added some lyrics to it, and yeah, had Brian been on there, it would have been great. And it's great even without him. And
Yeah.
I was just, as I was doing the video, I put that song on again, and that song was actually had some problems getting the clearance to actually play it in the video of all
Uh,
songs, but that kind of pissed me off. But
and
it's still,
Brian's on the Spanish version, by the way. They did a Spanish language version.
oh, I did not know that.
And Brian's on it, and you can clearly hear him on it. You can hear him in the audio mix doing the
Really?
harmonies. Yeah. So he
Uh,
he is on it in a shape or form.
I'll have to find that because I
Yeah.
did not even know that.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It
And
was
how
kind
long
of like,
ago after the original that was that recorded?
no, it was within the same. I think within a year or two. I mean, I think within the same time frame.
Okay.
They decided they did a Spanish version for the Spanish market, and somehow they managed to get Brian for that one.
Okay, yeah, I'm gonna have to check that out. Very,
Hmm.
see, I knew I would pull some good stuff out of here. That's why I
So
brought you on. Very good. Well, one of the things that, so in by 88, Landy had control of Brian for about
five,
6 or 7 years,
yeah,
6 years maybe.
yeah, about right,
And
yeah.
things started coming to a head.
I burned my brain out. My brain got burned out, and nothing left of my brain, you know?
You really think
I turned
it
into
was...
a vegetable over drugs, yeah. A lot of brain damage. Real lot of brain damage. And every day of my life I pay a little dues because of the drugs I took.
Brian Wilson is a perfect example of the fact that in my field, I'm an artist.
This man says he's the reason Brian Wilson functions today at all. Brian Wilson before, Brian Wilson after.
Did Dr. Landy save your life?
Absolutely. Yes, he did.
But success had a price, an astronomical price. The bills came in, $50,000 for vitamins, $25,000 for Landy's out-of-pocket expenses for 4 days in Hawaii. At one point, Landy's fees and extra charges were running well over $1 million a year. To offset Landy's fees, the Beach Boys donated an extra concert a month.
He said he'd be there a year to year and a half. Well, when it got to be about 5 years, we realized that that he has no intention of ever leaving Brian on his own.
It's now 9 years, and the family says the entire time, the sweet and loving Brian they knew has been isolated, virtually held a prisoner by Landy, and poisoned against them.
I find them to be people that are very sick. I mean, you know, I mean, I have some pity for them. We don't have access to them without Landy's supervision, videotaping, recording.
Everything has gone to hell between me and the Beach Boys. Totally gone to hell.
When other old friends tried to call, they couldn't get through the wall put up by Landy either. Dean Tora, group Jan and Dean.
I tried maybe 8, 10, 15 times.
Dean ever call you?
No.
Not in all these years.
We have no ongoing relationship. No.
Your daughters? Would you
My
like
daughter-
to see your daughters?
Yeah. I think my daughters are kind of off on a career.
You proud of them?
I'm very proud of my daughters. I think my daughters are probably two of the most special girls ever created.
Why don't you see them?
Why don't I see them? Well, gosh, you know, that's a hard question. I can't answer that question. I'm guilty for not being a good father. I was a druggie when I should have been a father.
Can you go tell them that?
Well, I could. I could.
Think you might?
No, I don't say I could. I'm going to. I've been waiting right time to call them. That's what it is, you know.
So far, his daughters have only been allowed to see him alone, 1 hour each, in the past 9 years.
He didn't want to see the children. The family beats him up all the time. The daughters especially.
The family says you've screened his phone calls for 9 years now.
Okay, I screened his phone calls for 1.5 years.
I was told that if Audrey, his mother, called, Brian was not allowed to take any calls.
She worked for Landy not in that first year, but within the last 2 years.
There was, in the time that I was there, not a single phone call that I was ever allowed to put through to Brian.
Screen calls, I've never heard of that before in my life. I don't know. Screen calls, there's no screen calls.
But they say you have systematically ensured that none of them can get to him.
That's crazy. He has had a number of lawyers who are all able to get him.
John Mason was
Mason was a major lawyer that got him out of the trust.
And he could always get in?
Mason got him ongoingly.
I could not reach Brian Wilson on the telephone in the entire 5 years that I represented him.
I do not give drugs to Brian.
Now they've got me on the medicine that keeps me in an even place, so I don't go woo out of control high or whoa down low. You know what I mean?
We had talked about in preparing for this discussion, there were some of his mental issues that were actually addressed by a doctor, and that was Dr. Peter Room.
Well, Peter Room was, he was trained, he was a Beach Boys fan, and he was in the record industry, and he left the record industry and became he studied like mental disabilities and, therapy and treating people with developmental disabilities and assessing people with possible severe mental illness. So he went back to school after leaving the record industry, and he got a degree in disability counseling and client assessment. But he already knew Brian, and he had become sort of like a consultant on the Beach Boys legacy projects when they did their historical projects, like box sets or books about official books. So he was a Beach Boys collector too. So that's how he kind of entered their world as like a fan. He first met Brian around 1976, 77, during the midst of Brian is Back. So he was able to see Brian over different eras. So seeing Brian again during the Landy period, he started to see Brian declining. And there were a couple of points where he saw Brian in person and was able to assess, plus he was part of a group of people that of fans and not exactly close friends of Brian, but acquaintances of Brian that were very worried about him when he was under Landy's care. And some of the people that actually worked for Landy, they were called the surf Nazis.
Mm.
They were worried about Brian too.
Mm.
So they were like feeding some like videotapes to an audio tapes of the recording sessions for Brian's solo album and videotape shot in the studio. And so Peter Room would see this stuff of Brian just sort of like not being able to follow directions, his eyes rolling into the back of his head involuntarily and just kind of like nodding off. And also just like these involuntary tremors. And he was able to determine after a few in-person encounters with Brian that Brian most likely had a condition called tardive dyskinesia. And I'm seeing commercials about that now on television, that it's a condition, and it's there's these commercials for like medication to try to address the symptoms, but it's like tremors and that half of Brian's face seemed paralyzed kind of thing.
Mm.
And it was all attributed to the psychotropic drugs that Landy was prescribing Brian that he had no business prescribing because he wasn't a psychiatrist. He was a psychologist. And what Peter Room writes about is the fact that they found a psychiatrist for Brian to basically write out their prescriptions, but Landy was calling all the shots. Landy was working very closely with the psychiatrist, and whatever Landy said went. The psychiatrist was this old man, who was like not going to put up a fight. Brian was showing all the signs of the absolute worst side effects of these psychotropic drugs, and they were really concerned. All of these friends that Peter Room was among them, and they led a charge to get Brian the hell away from Landy. And some of them went directly to Carl and explained all of this to Carl. And that's one of the things most that prompted Carl to take legal action and break up that relationship once and for all.
And Landy did lose his license too throughout all this.
He lost his license, but he'd insinuated himself so deeply into Brian's life that he was still technically going to be his business partner.
Mm.
And of course, there's that famous story, and that's in the movie Love and Mercy, that he was going to be the sole beneficiary in Brian's will.
Yeah, that's going pretty far. I mean, it's amazing that he got away with it for that long.
Exactly.
And the thing I noticed after Landy, or there was a period, I'm not sure when, but post Landy, I could tell Brian's speech was different.
Yes.
And the way he presented a lot of his ideas, it just sounded more childlike. If you even listen to the interview he did in 1976, where he's sitting there smoking, it's the Brian's back period. He sounds completely normal.
Yeah.
He's able to carry on and give very, very lucid information and speak with some authority. But later on, it was so much more childlike, and I just assumed that was from years of the drugs that Landy was giving him, or so. I have to assume that because it was a change, and I don't know where it would have come from other than that.
Yeah, I've seen it read and I've seen it said that the drugs that Landy gave Brian did more damage to him and to his brain than any of the drugs that Brian was taking recreationally.
If you think about it, years before, by like the early 80s, I mean, Brian was in pretty good shape. I mean, he got the smoking figured out and the weight down, way down. He looked great. And Landy really did a good job there, but what was the need to control him? I mean, I think this was to control him with drugs. I think that's the thing. So
yeah, he would give, whenever Brian had to make a personal appearance or a television interview or all that, supposedly he would give Brian uppers. So if you watch some of those interviews that Brian did around the time of his first solo album, where he looked great. I mean, he was in great shape and he looked very healthy and clean and all that, and he was like really sort of like hyper. He was like giving all these great interviews where he was like funny and laughing and all that, and then as soon as the interview was over, they'd give him a downer and he would completely become like almost zombified. It's I will say that movie Love and Mercy, I saw it opening night, if I'm not mistaken. And having read everything that I read about the Beach Boys, I turned to my friend Jack, who I saw the movie with him, and I said, "Boy, oh boy, this is really, I mean, they had to change the particulars of some of the stuff because it's a movie, but in terms of the essence, boy, did they nailed a lot of it. I mean, really, really nailed it. Right down to the fact that it was Carl who ultimately split up Brian and Landy.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, I didn't
Uh,
really cover how Carl was involved in that when I
yeah,
did my video, but that's good to know.
yeah,
Family came and kind of bailed him out. Hmm.
yeah. I mean, it got to the point. I mean, Carl and Carl and Brian's mother, Audrey, along with Carl and along with Mike. I mean, they ended up suing. I don't know, remember if they sued Brian, but they certainly sued over that book that supposedly the autobiography that Brian put out in 1991. Wouldn't it be nice? Which basically Landy wrote. I mean, it's supposed to be by Brian Wilson and Todd Gold, but the evidence indicates that Landy pretty much, wrote that book, and he made them look so bad that they ended up suing him, or suing somebody. So yeah, they Carl was instrumental in ending that whole period, and getting Brian the right help, because Landy even misdiagnosed Brian. So not only was he feeding him psychotropic drugs, it was drugs for a misdiagnosis.
Hmm. Yeah, it was what a mess. It's amazing that Brian has lasted and the other two brothers have passed away,
Yeah.
but I mean, he did have enough strength to carry on. And then after a lengthy, I guess, recovery period, he got remarried.
Yeah.
He was able to revisit Smile.
Right.
And the real redemption, I guess, the real happy ending, if it is, can be considered that, is his release of Brian Wilson Presents Smile.
Yeah, I mean it was tough to get there, but they did. I think that a lot of it had to do with, when Carl was still alive, I believe Brian pitched taking Pet Sounds on tour with the Beach Boys. And Carl shot it down because that was such a Brian heavy album. And at that point, Carl didn't trust Brian to be able to see it through. He didn't think Brian was going to be able to have the stamina to be on stage for the full show and to do all the vocals that would have been required of him. And at that point, it's sad to say, Carl had lost faith in Brian's ability. So Carl shot it down. And what happens? 3 years after Carl dies, Brian just goes and does it on his own, and it's terrific. They do a terrific job, and I think that gave him the confidence, so that when the idea came up, like, what do we do next? We can't just keep touring with Pet Sounds, for all eternity. What's next? And when the idea came up to do Smile, he didn't balk. He didn't just reject it outright. He had already made some peace with some of the songs from Smile, particularly Heroes and Villains. He was comfortable playing that song again. And so it started out as it was just going to be a concert. It was going to be a live show. And then they decided, well, we've got the show worked out. Let's do the album. And I think that went a long way towards exercising a lot of the demons that Brian was carrying around with him. It's a terrific album. It's won him his first Grammy.
Yeah, and I think that clearly he loved the success of it and the adulation that came with it. It was finally, it's weird that somebody else basically had to complete it for him, but they did such a good job. They had plenty of material to choose from. So the Brian Wilson Presents Smile was actually much longer than the original album would have been, but that ended up not being an issue because it fit on a CD. I mean, it was great for the live show. And then the success of that, winning the Grammy, reopened the idea to open up the actual Smile sessions from 1966-67.
We got a taste of that on the box set from 1993, the Good Vibrations 30 Years of the Beach Boys box set. They went through the vaults, and they included about 30 minutes of snippets from the Smile sessions, which had never been heard before outside of, like, fourth generation bootlegs. But this Smile box set he was on board for it because, like I said, he had exercised his demons. He had made peace with this thing that had freaked him out so much that he avoided it for years and years. And again, I believe that the Smile Sessions won a Grammy as well.
Mm.
And its time had come, I guess. But it was a fantastic box. Of course, I have it. I bought it the day it came out. There
Hmm.
was no way I wasn't going to. I mean, I had again those fourth generation bootlegs for years to be able to get pristine sounding copies. There were some surprises that even I had never heard before. I thought I'd heard pretty much everything. The funny thing is about the Smile Sessions and about Brian Wilson Presents Smile, because I had those bootlegs even by the time that Brian's version of Smile came out, is just how close that album was to being finished.
Yeah, that's how I took it too. And I know some of the stuff was done, you know, 68. There's some things added because a couple songs got added to albums in the late 60s, like Cabin Essence or a couple
Right.
others. But
But it
but
had all been
generally,
recorded. It had all been recorded.
yes.
Yeah.
And I was surprised too with all the stuff that they had done. It's like, how could they not have gotten an album out? There's enough stuff here, and obviously there's some lyrics that had to be finished, and how it would have
Right.
fit together, I don't know, and apparently nobody does. But yeah, it seems that had I don't know what it would have taken to get it finished, but it seemed like they were awfully close.
That's how I felt too. And I can't imagine that. I mean, they did such a good job for the most part, sequencing it for Brian Wilson Presents Smile. I can't imagine that they couldn't have done that back in 67, 66, 67. Even in 73, when Carl supposedly went back into the tapes to see he was going to try to assemble Smile for Warner Brothers. I can't believe that they couldn't see how the pieces could fit together. And yeah, you bring back Van Dyke Parks for like a day or two. Some of the lyrics were already written. Some of the lyrics that we hadn't heard before that are on Brian Wilson Presents Smile were written in 67, 66, 67. But Brian, in 2004, Brian couldn't read Van Dyke's handwriting. So he called Van Dyke out of the blue and said, hey, Van Dyke, we're going to be finishing Smile. Listen, these lyrics here that you wrote in 1966 for Do You Dig Worms? On the album, it's called Roll Plymouth Rock.
Hmm.
And he's reading these lyrics that Van Dyke hasn't, probably thought about in 30 years or 27 years. And Brian just expects him to summon them up from memory because he's trying to read them off of the paper and he can't. So Van Dyke was like, how about I come over? so so he drove over to Brian and they sat down and they started like working everything out. And yeah, I mean, I think they worked together for 3 days, maybe in 2004 to get that album done. And just imagine if they were all in their right heads
Yeah.
and
Well,
that
that tells
album.
me that had Van Dyke Parks been able to stick around, I mean,
Yeah,
they could have finished it. I mean, he tried, he came back and then he left, but he
right.
wasn't being treated very well. And this is does not just by Mike Love, but by Brian. The issue that I think got Van Dyke Parks rankled and had him leave was how Brian treated him. Like, hey, you
Mm,
work for me. And he always would remind him of that. And,
right.
Brian was just kind of losing it. So, Parks was, I think, just had enough of all the entourage around there as well. Not
Yeah.
that he didn't partake himself, but I mean, it's too bad that Van Dyke Parks was not offered the same, I guess, creative plane that maybe another writer would have. Maybe that Tony Asher was offered, to really have some control over the situation because Van Dyke Parks was very involved in it, more so than the other Beach Boys.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it would have made the fact that he did help finish it in 2000, for the 2004 shows me that it was close. If it just took a few days, I mean,
Yeah.
he could have helped finish that. So,
Yeah.
what would have been, what could have been.
Ultimately, it turned out pretty well for everybody involved. It just took 27, 30 years. But it was definitely what Brian needed at the time, that healing. And also it was really great for his solo career because that same year that he put out Smile, or his Smile. He put out another album. He put out a solo album called Getting In Over My Head, which wasn't very well received. It's not a bad album, but it's not a great album. And had that been, his big solo release for that decade, it would have his solo career would have just been But putting out Smile, I mean, it gave him a real shot in the arm, and I think it really brought a lot of healing to his mind and his soul.
Well, I think it did, and I think it brought a lot of healing to a lot of Beach Boys fans too, because what a wonderful gift to have the Smile sessions for Beach Boys fans, not just to indulge in, but to make their own smile. That is really very cool. And some people, not everybody agrees with that, I guess. And there's all kinds of disagreement as to how it would have gone together. I don't know that I'm not that hung up on that. I'm just happy to listen to the music, and
Yeah.
you can kind of figure out maybe how you can figure out how some of it would have gone together. And I don't know that the sequencing makes a whole lot of it's not a deal breaker to get one thing out of a couple things out of sequence, but not that there even was one. But I just think it's one of the coolest things that any band could leave behind for their fans to assemble for them.
And I think that that's the capstone of the Beach Boys story. Is I mean, they put out an album in 2012. In addition to the Smile sessions, they put out a new album called That's Why God Made the Radio. That actually was the first time that Brian had a producer credit again after Beach Boys Love You.
Oh, okay.
Um, uh, that credit on why That's Why God Made the Radio. It's the first time since Beach Boys Love You that a Beach Boys album said produced by Brian Wilson. And so that reached, I think, number 3 on the Billboard charts, which was a really great
Yeah.
performance. So I mean, I think that's really where the story should end. It's not over still, because as long as there's breath coming out of Mike Love, those Beach Boys are going to keep going.
Well, I
Um,
think, yeah, and you probably saw the reunion that was at the
I did.
the 50th anniversary, which was 2012, I believe.
I was
And
there
I
for
was
that.
able to see that show, which
Hmm.
I thought was that's kind of where I put the end of it.
Yeah,
I'd never felt that I ever needed to see them again, and I
right.
haven't. And I thought that was the appropriate place to end it. And they're still going on, but a lot of people are, and so I guess I can't fault them. But well, yes, I can. Yeah, I can fault them. I think I did see Brian Wilson live in 2019,
Yeah.
and that was with the Zombies, and that was just a pathetic performance. He had no business being on stage. It was embarrassing. He was coughing through songs. He was speaking his lyrics, and it was really a sad thing to see. So that's really taken it too far. And I don't think he's been out much since that tour.
If it couldn't have been 74, 75, 2012 is a great place to end the story. They had the triumph of the Smile sessions. They had the triumph of an album that sold well, and they had this 50th anniversary tour. Because within a year, Mike pissed everybody off again by, but the way it was characterized is he kicked
He fired
Brian and
him.
Al out of the.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it was just for that tour only. Then we're gonna go back to the way it
Yeah,
was.
yeah.
Yeah, I
Mike,
mean, and some people go see that, and it's fine, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, you gotta draw the line for yourself somewhere. I know where I draw my line. It's different where people draw their line, and
yeah,
that's just how it is.
right,
I mean, I don't know how much longer it can go for a lot of these 80-year-olds, but
right,
we're at
right.
the end here.
Well, and that's the other thing is well, he fuels. We've talked before about I call them the Brianistas, and that's the camp that's Brian did everything, nobody else did anything else, especially not Mike Love. And then you got the Mike Love camp and all that, and it's just the problem is Mike's acceptance speech at the Hall of Fame and firing Brian and Al right after the 50th anniversary tour. He didn't really fire them, but that's the way it was. That's the way it
Hmm.
came off.
Yeah.
And even the fact that he sued Brian when Brian put out Brian Wilson Presents Smile. Mike filed
Mhm.
a lawsuit against him. So he can't help him. I feel for Mike because he did get screwed a lot
Yeah.
with the songwriting credits and the publishing right, all that kind of stuff. He just goes about it in a way that it's really hard to root for him.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, Mike Love's reputation has a lot to do with Mike Love, and you can't overlook some of these things, you know. And yeah, he did get screwed in, but everybody in the music industry does, so he's got good company there. It's interesting to see how the fans take sides. So much like Lennon versus McCartney,
Oh yeah,
we have the Brian Wilson is a genius with the capital G. Everything that went wrong with the Beach Boys is Mike Love's fault. And then
right.
you've got I guess a Mike Love camp as well. But it's really the Beach Boys, the people that take sides here really do the band a disservice because they really remove it really harms the credibility of not just the individual fans, but this constant narrative control that's heavily biased by some very senior writers, I might add,
Yeah.
that has really harmed the history. And things are going to correct itself, and these writers will be put in their place, like many are over time. And some
Mhm.
people get things wrong out of not intention, but some get it wrong purposely because of malice.
Yeah.
And we've seen that in the Beach Boys history, which is a shame.
Absolutely. So yeah, you've got these camps that form up, and yeah, exactly. It's like Lennon and McCartney. But I think you made an incredibly, just a really great point in one of your videos where you talked about, Brian's getting addicted to drugs. Brian is drinking. Brian is doing all this. Brian's hurting the future stakes of the band. But that's Mike Love's fault. How does Mike get blamed for all the things that Brian doing? That's just ridiculous. And I thought that was an excellent point, and one that needs to be made apparently.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's not just fans saying it, but a lot of, like I said, some writers as well. And that's
yeah,
what's very disappointing, where they just can't separate their fanboyism
right.
from the printed word.
Yeah,
So, I mean, Mike Love is no angel. Who is in that band? It's really, and I don't know these people personally, but I
yeah,
just know what I know. And I think
right.
to offer some balance, I think I don't see what the problem with that is. Why do people have to take sides? I think it says more about the actual fans than it does about the Beach Boys.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, sir, I think that may be a good place to end. I really that six-part series took a lot out of me, and I didn't feel like Brian Wilson at the end of Brian Wilson Loves You, but I thought this was going to be a nice way to kind of recap and go over a couple things that I glossed over with somebody who really knows the Beach Boys well. So I really appreciate you joining me here.
I'm thrilled that you invited me. I mean, I was very excited about the chance to do this, and I've had a great time.
Well, great. We'll certainly have you back. I'm going to put some links below to your new Batman bookazine,
Thanks.
and there's a couple articles I'll also put below the things we talked about today. That Peter Room article. And as a friend of Brian Wilson, he had a
Right.
very unique perspective and position in which to make some diagnoses, I guess. So I'll put that
Absolutely.
link below. I thought that was very interesting. Thanks for providing that.
Sure.
So, all right, Glenn. Well, let's end it here. Thank you so much. And everybody, thank you for watching Pop Goes the 60s.